Nobody in the small town of Creston Hollow, Colorado could say with certainty who had been leaving the bread. It had started sometime in the bitter January of 1878, when the snow piled 3 feet deep against the stoops of the houses along Mill Creek Road, and the women who lived alone in those houses, women whose husbands had been swallowed by mine collapses, or carried off by fever, or simply ridden away one morning and never returned, woke to find a loaf of dark, dense sourdough sitting on their porch steps, wrapped in brown cloth and tied with a length of plain twine. No note, no name. Just bread, still faintly warm from wherever it had been baked, dusted sometimes with a little snow that had fallen after it had been placed there, which meant whoever left it came in the early hours before dawn. Ella Grady had received her first loaf on the 8th of January, 11 days after she buried her husband Thomas in the hard ground behind the Baptist church. Thomas had been a good man, steady and careful, a carpenter by trade, 34 years old and in the full health of his life when a fever took him in 6 days flat. He had left her with a house, a plot of kitchen garden that lay dormant under the snow, a 4-year-old boy named Samuel, and very little else. The savings they had kept in the tin box under the floorboards would last her perhaps 3 months if she was careful. After that, she did not know. She was 28 years old. She had come to Creston Hollow from Missouri as Thomas's bride 6 years before, and she had built a life here, stitch by stitch, day by day, and now she was taking it apart and trying to understand what she had left to work with. The morning she found the bread, she had been standing at her kitchen window watching Samuel chase the family's old hound dog through the yard, his breath coming in small clouds in the cold air, his laughter unmuffled by grief the way only a child's laughter can be. She had a cup of coffee in her hands that had gone cold. She had been standing there for perhaps 20 minutes without drinking it, which was a thing she would not have done a month ago. She saw the loaf when she opened the front door to call Samuel in for breakfast. It sat on the top step, wrapped neatly, and when she picked it up she found it was heavier than she expected and still held the ghost of warmth. She looked up and down the road. The snow was undisturbed except for the tracks of a single horse heading north, toward the mouth of Raven Canyon, where the foothills began their long climb toward the Rockies. The tracks were already softening in the morning light. She brought the bread inside, unwrapped it, and sliced it carefully. It was a sourdough with a deep crackled crust and a soft interior, flavored with something she could not name, maybe a hint of wild honey or herbs she had never tasted in a kitchen. It was the best bread she had eaten in years. She set a slice in front of Samuel and one in front of herself, and they ate their breakfast quietly, and she did not cry, which felt like a small miracle. That was January. The loaves kept coming. Not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week, always before dawn, always wrapped the same way, always left on the step without ceremony. Ella asked around. She was not the only one receiving them. Martha Hollins, who had lost her husband in the Grayback mine disaster the previous spring, was getting loaves. Old Agnes Prout, whose husband had died of his heart in September, was getting them. Nora Webb, just 22, who had been widowed when her young husband drowned crossing the swollen Animas River, was getting them too. None of them knew who was responsible. The town of Creston Hollow had its theories. Some said it was Pastor Whitmore doing penance for something, though the pastor had the soft, pink hands of a man who had never baked a day in his life. Some said it was a couple of the older ranch wives who had organized a kind of charity. Some said it was old Bart Cooney, the baker on Main Street, working off a guilty conscience over something or other. Ella did not speculate much. She was too busy surviving. By February she had taken in laundry from 3 of the families on the east side of town, and by March she had arranged with the school teacher, a thin, anxious young man named Harvey Pell, to copy out his correspondence and grade his arithmetic papers in exchange for a small payment each week. She was managing. She was keeping the lights on and the food on the table and Samuel clothed and fed and loved, and she was doing it mostly on her own, but those loaves of bread appeared on her porch with a regularity that felt like someone out there was paying attention, and that mattered more than she would have admitted to anyone. Spring came in April, slow and wet. The snow retreated up the mountainsides, and the creek ran high and milky with snowmelt, and the kitchen garden came back to life, which helped considerably. The bread kept coming. By now it had become such a fixture that Samuel had started calling it mountain bread, though he could not explain to his mother why he used that word. He just said it tasted like the mountains. She thought he was probably right. In May, Ella overheard a conversation in the general store that stopped her cold. She had been standing at the counter waiting for Horace Finch to weigh out her flour when two cattlemen came in, weather-beaten and loud, and one of them said to the other, loud enough for the whole store to hear, that he had seen Eli Ralston coming down out of Raven Canyon before first light on a Tuesday morning with two big saddlebags over his horse. Ella did not know the name Eli Ralston. She turned just slightly, pretending to examine a row of canned goods, and listened. The second cattleman grunted and said that did not surprise him, because Eli Ralston was the kind of man who did strange things at strange hours, and nobody ever questioned him about it because he was 6'3" and built like a ponderosa pine, and because he had once, single-handedly, tracked down and returned a herd of stolen cattle belonging to the Rafter T Ranch, and the men of Creston Hollow had a long memory for that kind of thing. The first cattleman said that he reckoned Eli Ralston was the one leaving all that bread for the widows, and the second cattleman laughed, not unkindly, and said that sounded exactly like something Eli Ralston would do. Then they bought their tobacco and went out. Ella stood there with her hands flat on the counter and felt something shift in her chest, a feeling she could not immediately identify. It was not grief, and it was not loneliness, and it was not gratitude exactly, though it was close to gratitude, closer than she had felt to anything warm in a long time. She asked Horace Finch who Eli Ralston was. Horace, who was a small man with an encyclopedic knowledge of every person within 40 miles, told her without hesitation. Eli Ralston was 33 years old. He had come to the Colorado Territory from Wyoming about 6 years back, right around the same time the Grayback mine had been opened. He had built himself a cabin up in the canyon country above Creston Hollow, about 4 miles up a switchback trail that most horses did not enjoy. He trapped in the winter, ran a small line of cattle in the summer on a high meadow he had somehow cleared and fenced himself, grew his own kitchen garden, hunted elk, and had a reputation for being the most self-sufficient man in 3 counties. He came to town maybe once a month for things he could not make or grow himself. He was not unfriendly, Horace said carefully, but he was not exactly a social creature. He had never married. He kept largely to himself. He was, Horace said with a slight diplomatic pause, a very private man. Ella thought about this all the way home. She thought about it while she hung the laundry, and while she made supper, and while she listened to Samuel say his prayers before bed. She thought about a man who lived alone in a canyon, and rose before dawn and rode 4 miles down a mountain trail in the dark to leave bread on the stoops of women who were struggling, and then rode 4 miles back up again before anyone could see him and say thank you. By the following morning she had decided she was going to thank him anyway. She told herself it was the right thing to do. She told herself it was the decent, Christian thing, to acknowledge a kindness properly instead of simply accepting it in silence. She told herself it had nothing to do with the fact that she had slept better than she had in weeks after making the decision, or that she had woken feeling something that felt almost like anticipation. She arranged for Margaret Hollins to keep an eye on Samuel for the day. She packed a small tin of the sugar cookies she had made the day before, because arriving at a man's cabin empty-handed after months of receiving his gifts seemed wrong. She saddled Thomas's old mare, a steady brown horse named Clover who had made the trip into the foothills plenty of times. And on a bright Wednesday morning in the middle of May, with the wildflowers just beginning to come up along the road and the aspen trees shimmering in the new warmth, she rode north toward Raven Canyon. The switchback trail was exactly as difficult as Horace had implied. It was narrow, carved into the rocky face of the canyon wall in tight zigzags, with the creek roaring 60 feet below on one side and the mountain rising sheer above on the other. Clover took it steadily, her shoes ringing on the stone, and Ella kept her eyes on the trail and did not look down more than she had to. It took her the better part of an hour to reach the rim of the canyon, where the land opened suddenly into a long, south-facing meadow of astonishing beauty. She stopped at the top and simply looked. The meadow was maybe 40 acres, ringed by dark spruce and pine, with a stream cutting through the lower end and a cabin sitting at the north edge near the tree line. It was a proper cabin, not a hastily thrown-together trapper's shack. It was made of squared logs, 2 rooms at least by the look of it, with a good stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke rose in the still morning air. There was a lean-to stable beside it, a kitchen garden fenced in with split rails, a woodpile that was taller than the cabin eaves and 20 feet long, and hanging on a line between 2 pines, the largest collection of pelts she had ever seen outside a trading post. A man was splitting wood at the far end of the yard. He had not yet seen her. She could see, even from this distance, that Horace Finch had not exaggerated about his size. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he moved with the economical ease of a man who did physical labor the way other men breathed, without thinking about it, without strain. He brought them all down and the sections of log fell apart cleanly, and he set the next one and brought it down again. Ella nudged Clover forward. He heard the hoofbeats before she was halfway across the meadow and straightened, turning to face her, the maul held loosely at his side. She could see his face now as she rode closer. He had dark hair, a little longer than fashionable, and a dark beard trimmed close, and the kind of weathered, sun-bronzed face that comes from years of living outdoors. His eyes were gray, or near enough to gray to call it that, and they watched her approach with an expression that was not unfriendly but was very careful, the expression of a man who was not used to visitors and was deciding how to feel about one. She pulled Clover up about 10 feet from where he stood and said, "Are you Eli Ralston?" His voice, when he answered, was quiet and unhurried. "I am," he said. She took a breath. She had rehearsed this on the way up. She had planned a proper speech, something gracious and composed. What came out instead was, "You have been leaving bread on my porch for 4 months and I came to say thank you." Something moved across his face, too quick to read. He set the maul against the woodpile very carefully, the way a man sets something down when he is buying himself a moment to think. He looked at her, and then he looked at the ground, and then he looked at her again. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but he said it without any real conviction, and she could see from the way his jaw set that he knew it sounded unconvincing and had said it anyway out of some reflex toward privacy. "You are a bad liar, Mr. Ralston," she said. She was surprised to hear how steady her voice sounded. The corner of his mouth moved just barely. It was not quite a smile. "How did you find out it was me?" "2 cattlemen with loud voices in the general store," she said. He let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "Should have known," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She reached into the saddlebag and produced the tin of cookies. She leaned down from the saddle and held it out to him. He looked at it for a moment before he came forward and took it, and when he did, his fingers brushed her gloved hand, and she was aware of it in a way that surprised her. "Your bread has been keeping my family going since January," she said. "Myself and my boy, Samuel, he calls it mountain bread. He can always tell when a new loaf has arrived. I don't know how he knows, but he always does." She paused. "I am Ella Grady. My husband Thomas passed last December." He nodded slowly. He was holding the tin in both hands. "I heard about that," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said. She meant both things. She gathered the reins. "I'll let you get back to your work. I only wanted you to know that it mattered, more than you probably know." She was already turning Clover when he said, "Do you want some coffee?" She turned back. He was not looking directly at her. Instead, his gaze had gone to the middle distance in the way of a man who had surprised himself by saying something out loud and was now waiting to see what happened. "I would like that very much," she said. She dismounted and tied Clover to the fence rail, and he showed her to the cabin. It was the cleanest bachelor's cabin she had ever been in, which she admitted was a short list, but still. Everything was in its place. The floor was swept. The single window was clean. There was a real table with 2 chairs, which struck her suddenly as poignant. 2 chairs when he lived entirely alone, but she did not remark on it. There were shelves along one wall with books, actual books, more than she would have expected. She found herself reading their spines while he put the coffee on, and she identified a Bible, a copy of David Copperfield, something by a man named Thoreau that she was not familiar with, 2 books on botany, a thick volume on trapping and tanning, and a small, worn book that turned out to be a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. She was standing with the Whitman in her hand when he set a cup of coffee in front of her on the table. He glanced at the book. "You can read it if you like," he said, as if that were a perfectly normal thing to offer a woman he had met 4 minutes ago. "You like poetry?" she asked. "I like that one," he said. "Some of it." He sat down across from her and wrapped his hands around his own cup. "Some of it I don't understand." She smiled at that, a real smile, the first one that had come without effort in months. "That is honest," she said. They drank their coffee and talked, and she had not expected it to be easy, but it was. Not in the way of easy conversation with someone you have known for years, but in the way of 2 people who have both been quiet for a long time, and find that the sound of another person talking is like water after a dry stretch. He asked about Samuel, and his questions were the careful, genuine kind, not the polite, reflexive kind that people asked when they were waiting for the subject to change. He listened when she answered. She asked how he had come to the canyon, and he told her simply in plain language that he had come from Wyoming after his father died and left him a small amount of money and no other obligations, and he had ridden south and then west and then higher and higher until he found a place that suited him, and this was it. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked, and then immediately felt she had overstepped, but he only looked out the window at his meadow for a moment before he said, "Sometimes." He did not elaborate, and she did not push. She stayed for perhaps an hour. When she rose to go, she opened the tin and insisted he keep the cookies, because she had brought them for him, and he accepted them with a gravity that suggested cookies were something he received only slightly more often than thank-you visits from widows. She rode back down the mountain feeling lighter than she had since January. She could not have explained why precisely. She told herself it was simply the satisfaction of doing the right thing, of expressing gratitude properly. She told herself that on the entire ride home, and she almost believed it by the time she reached Creston Hollow. She was back the following Wednesday. She had not planned it exactly. She had made a large pot of beef stew the day before, enough to last several days, and she had thought, without examining the thought too closely, that a man who lived alone in a mountain cabin might appreciate a jar of good stew. And so she put one in her saddlebag along with a pan of cornbread and rode back up the canyon trail. This time when he heard her coming he was already outside, and he watched her cross the meadow with an expression that she might have called wary if she had not also caught something else in it, a kind of stillness that was different from wariness, something more like anticipation that he was trying not to show. "I brought stew," she said by way of greeting. He looked at the jar in her hands. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I made too much," she said, which was not entirely a lie. He invited her in, and this time the coffee was already on as if he had started it before she arrived, which she noticed and chose not to mention. This went on through May and into June. She came up on Wednesdays, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just herself and sometimes Samuel, who took immediately and with tremendous enthusiasm to the whole enterprise of riding up a mountain to visit a strange man. Eli was good with the boy in a way that was not performative, not the exaggerated cheerfulness that some adults put on for children like a costume. He was simply natural with him, answered his questions directly, showed him things, let him help when Samuel demanded to be useful, which he did constantly. The first time Samuel came along, He made a beeline for the wood pile, picked up a small piece of wood, and announced that he was going to make something. Eli handed him a small knife without hesitation, and then sat beside him for the next hour and showed him how to whittle, patiently correcting his grip, guiding the blade angle with steady hands, saying nothing when Samuel cut himself slightly on the thumb and began to cry, just waiting until the crying stopped, and then saying, in the same quiet voice he used for everything, "Ready to try again." Ella watched this from across the yard, where she was pulling weeds from his kitchen garden because it needed doing, and she could not leave a garden in that state without doing something about it. And she felt something she recognized as dangerous, but could not make herself step back from. She was falling in love with him. She was not ready for it, and she was not sure she was entitled to it, and she thought about Thomas every day and wondered what he would make of it. And the honest answer she arrived at, after sitting with the question for a long time, was that Thomas had been a practical man who had loved her genuinely and who would have wanted her and Samuel to have enough. And this felt, slowly, carefully, like the beginning of enough. She did not say any of this to Eli. He was not a man who rushed toward things. She understood that about him from the first visit, and it had only become clearer over the weeks. He was careful in the way that mountain country makes people careful, not because he was cold or distant, but because he knew the cost of carelessness at altitude. He said things when he meant them, and did not say them when he didn't, which made the things he said land with considerable weight. He told her in the first week of June that her cornbread was the best he had eaten. He told her in the second week that he had enjoyed having Samuel around, and that the boy was sharp as a tack. He told her in the third week, very quietly, almost as if he were telling the fence post rather than her, that Wednesdays had become his favorite day. She had been planting extra bean seedlings in his garden when he said it, and she stayed very still for a moment with her hands in the dirt. Then she looked up at him. He was leaning on the fence rail 6 feet away looking at the mountains with enormous concentration. "Mine too," she said. The summer moved the way good summers in the mountains do, slowly and generously, with long days of clear sky and cool nights, and the smell of pine and wild grass hanging over everything. Ella found she was managing better. The laundry work was steady, and she had taken on a new job helping Agnes Prout, who was older and arthritic, with her house cleaning twice a week for a modest wage. Samuel was thriving, growing an inch a month it seemed, asking questions at a rate that exhausted everyone around him except, it turned out, Eli Ralston, who appeared to have an infinite capacity for answering questions about why pine trees kept their needles in winter, and how beavers knew how to build dams, and what the stars were made of. Samuel had begun calling him Mr. Eli, which was neither his given name nor his surname used alone but some 4-year-old synthesis, and Eli answered to it with a kind of quiet pleasure that he did a poor job of hiding. In July, Ella arrived at the cabin one Wednesday to find a note on the door. She felt a swift, cold contraction of anxiety reading it, which told her more about the state of her feelings than she had previously acknowledged. The note read, "Gone to East Pasture to check fence. Back by midday. Doors open." She read it twice. He had known she was coming. He had left a note so she would know where he was and that she was welcome inside. She stood on the porch for a long moment with the note in her hand, and then she went inside and put the coffee on and sat at his table with his Walt Whitman book and waited for him. He came back an hour later, dusty and warm from the ride, and stopped in the doorway when he saw her at the table with the book and the coffee cups and the midday light coming through the window, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen there before. It was unguarded. All that careful distance he kept was gone for a moment, just a moment, and what was underneath it was something like longing so straightforward and uncomplicated that it made her chest ache. He crossed to the table and sat down, and they drank their coffee, and she read him a poem from the Whitman book, one about grass and open country, and he listened with his eyes on the table, and when she finished he said, without looking up, "That one I understand." In August, There was an incident that changed things, though not in the way trouble usually changes things. Ella had been riding home from the canyon late on a Wednesday, later than she usually stayed, because the afternoon had gotten away from them in a long conversation about whether Samuel should start school in September. The school being a one-room affair that Harvey Pell ran on the south edge of town, which Ella felt would be good for Samuel's socialization, and Eli felt would be good for Samuel's arithmetic, and both of them had turned out to have a great deal to say about it. She was on the lower stretch of the switchback trail, maybe a mile above the canyon floor, when Clover shied suddenly and nearly went sideways off the trail. Ella kept her seat, barely grabbing mane and collecting the reins hard, and then she saw what had spooked the mare. A man on a bay horse was coming up the trail from below, and he had come around a blind bend fast, and the two horses had startled each other. The man was a stranger. He was perhaps 40, with a red beard and small eyes that moved quickly, and he had the look of someone who was not from this country and was not comfortable in it. He brought his horse under control and looked at her with an expression that made her skin prickle. "Afternoon," he said, in a tone that made the word into something else. "Afternoon," she said, very level, gathering Clover and preparing to move past him because the trail was barely wide enough for two horses and she intended to be the one who kept going. "You coming from up above?" he asked, not moving. "I am," she said. "Excuse me." He did not move immediately. He sat looking at her with those quick eyes, and she kept her face entirely composed and her hands very still, because horses feel everything in the reins and she needed Clover steady. "That Ralston's place up there," he said. "I couldn't say," she said. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that this man was deciding something. Then he moved his horse aside just enough for her to pass, and she pressed Clover forward and went down the trail without looking back, and she did not let out the breath she was holding until she was onto the flat at the canyon floor and could hear no hoofbeats behind her. She told Eli about it the following Wednesday. His expression during this recounting was extremely still in a way she had come to recognize as his version of being very bothered by something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Red beard," he said, "bay horse, big man kind of wide through the shoulders." "That sounds right," she said. "That's Harker," he said, "Dale Harker. He's been trying to buy land in the canyon for a year. I've told him twice the land isn't for sale and told him once with more emphasis." He paused. "He shouldn't have been on that trail talking to you like that." "He wasn't violent," she said. "No," Eli agreed. "But he was measuring." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to ride the east trail from now on when you come up. It's longer, but it comes out behind the tree line and you can see the whole meadow before anyone on the trail below can see you." She noted that he said when you come up rather than if you come up, and she stored that detail somewhere warm. "All right," she said. "And I'm going to ride down with you from now on," he said, in the tone of a man who expects to argue about this. She did not argue. "All right," she said again. He blinked, as if he had braced for resistance and was not sure what to do without it. He rode down with her every Wednesday after that. It added 2 hours to his afternoon there and back, and he never mentioned it as an inconvenience. She began to realize that the parts of her week she counted most were Wednesday mornings, when she packed whatever she was bringing and saddled Clover, and Wednesday evenings, when he rode beside her through the golden late afternoon light down the switchback trail, talking quietly about whatever they were talking about that week, which was everything and nothing. The creek levels and the price of flour in town, and what Samuel had said the day before that was funny, and what books she had read, and whether he thought the autumn was coming early this year. He had an opinion on everything, and expressed all of them in the same unhurried, deliberate way, and she had come to find that voice so necessary to her that she could not imagine the canyon trail without it. In September, Samuel started school. He hated it for exactly 1 week, during which he informed his mother every evening that Harvey Pell was the worst person alive, and that he intended to become a trapper when he grew up and did not need arithmetic for that. Ella relayed this to Eli on their next Wednesday, And Eli thought about it seriously, and then said that actually a trapper needed to count pelts and calculate the weight and the price per pound and manage a seasonal budget. And the next time Samuel came to the cabin, Eli spent an hour teaching him arithmetic using pine cones and a piece of slate, framing every problem as a trapping scenario. And Samuel went back to school the following Monday with a substantially improved attitude and, more usefully, the ability to add and subtract to 20. Ella watched this happen and felt something so enormous and quiet that she could not have put it in words if she had tried. October came in gold and red, the aspens turning up and down the canyon walls, the mornings sharp and cold with the smell of coming winter. The bread still arrived on her porch twice a week, because Eli had never stopped the practice, and she had never asked him to. There was something she loved about it still, about finding it there in the morning, about the knowledge it carried, the knowledge that in the hours before dawn, while she was still asleep and Samuel was still asleep, someone had thought about them and gotten on a horse and come down a mountain in the dark. On the second Wednesday in October, she arrived at the cabin to find Eli in his garden, which was mostly done for the season, pulling up the last of the dried bean stalks. The morning was cold enough that their breath showed, and the sky was the particular hard, brilliant blue of high-altitude October. She dismounted and came to help him without asking, and they worked alongside each other in the garden for half an hour, pulling and stacking, and then he said, without preamble and without looking up from what he was doing, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Do you plan to stay in Creston Hollow?" he said. She looked at him. He was focused on the bean stalks with extraordinary attention. "I haven't thought about leaving," she said carefully. "Good," he said. He pulled up another stalk. "That's good." She waited. When he did not continue, she said, "Is that the question?" He straightened and looked at her directly, which he was doing more often now, holding her gaze for longer than he used to. "No," he said. "The question is harder than that." She waited. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it," he said, "for a while now." He set down the stalks. He pushed his hat back slightly, which was a gesture she had learned meant he was working through something difficult. "The thing is, Ella, I haven't." He stopped. "Started again. Before you started coming up here, I thought I was fine. I thought I had everything I needed, the cabin and the land and the work, and it was enough. And then you started coming up on Wednesdays, and I realized that what I thought was enough had a very large thing missing from it. And I don't know how to be articulate about this because I am not a man who is good with words. You are better than you think," she said softly. He looked at her. "I think about you every day," he said. "I think about you and Samuel every day. I think about Wednesdays every day. And I would never want to put any kind of pressure on you because I know it hasn't been a year yet since Thomas, and I know that's not Eli," she said. He stopped. "I think about you every day too," she said. She said it quietly, and she held his gaze, and she watched something happen in his face, that careful, maintained distance dissolving all at once. He took a step toward her, and she took one toward him, and he took her hands in his, both of them. And she was struck by the size of his hands and the warmth of them and the gentleness, the way someone that large and that strong could hold something like it was made of glass. "I'm not asking you to rush anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just wanted you to know." "I know," she said, "and I want you to know the same." He raised her hand slightly, just barely, in something that was not quite a formal gesture but was not nothing either. "Then I'll keep knowing," he said, and he smiled then, fully, a real smile that she had not seen from him before in that form, unguarded and warm, and it changed his whole face, and she thought she would remember the exact quality of that moment for the rest of her life. The cold October air and the gold aspens, and the smell of the garden and his gray eyes warm above that unfamiliar smile. They went inside and had coffee and talked for 3 hours, and when he rode down with her that evening, the whole world was orange and red, and neither of them ran out of things to say. November brought the first real snow, and with it, a complication. Dale Harker had apparently not given up on the canyon land. Eli came to town on a gray November Monday for supplies, and found that Harker had been in the previous week asking questions about who owned the land in the Upper Canyon, and had been to see the county land office in the larger town of Birchfield, 20 miles south, to inquire about the title on Eli's parcel. This was legal, of course. Looking up a land title was a public record, but it was not comfortable, and Eli told Ella about it that week. "What does he want with canyon land?" she asked. "Silver," Eli said, "or the possibility of it. There's been talk about a vein running north from the Grayback Formation, and if it does, it runs through the Upper Canyon. Harker is a speculator. He buys mineral rights cheap and then turns them over when the surveyors come through." Ella thought about the Grayback mine disaster, which had killed 7 men the previous spring, including Martha Hollins's husband, and which had left a scar on the town of Creston Hollow that had not finished healing. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing unless he gives me reason," Eli said. "The land is mine, the title is clear, and there is nothing legal he can do about it. But I don't like a man who makes himself interested in my business." He said this last part in a tone that suggested Harker had been thoroughly informed of this position already. 2 weeks later, Eli arrived in Creston Hollow on a Thursday morning, which was unusual enough that Ella looked up from the laundry line with an expression she quickly tried to neutralize. He dismounted at her gate and she went to meet him. "Harker's been watching the trail," he said without ceremony. "I found tracks at the lower canyon 2 mornings running, and they're not cattlemen's tracks. He's watching who goes up and down." Ella understood immediately what he was concerned about. "He's watching to see who comes to see you," she said. "I don't want him knowing your business," Eli said. His jaw was set. "Or Samuel's." "What are you suggesting?" He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm suggesting that until this settles, maybe you don't come up on Wednesdays." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if it doesn't settle, it will," he said firmly. "I'm going to go talk to the county sheriff in Birchfield and make sure my position is formally documented. That usually makes men like Harker find easier targets." He met her eyes. "I just need you to be safe while I do it." She wanted to argue. She recognized this want and let it go. "All right," she said. "But Eli, you will come tell me when it's resolved." "The hour it's resolved," he said. He came on the 20th of November, which was a Saturday, and he knocked on her door in the late afternoon with snow on his shoulders and said simply, "Harker's gone. Sold his interest in the area to a mining company from Denver and moved south." Sheriff helped him understand his options. She stepped back and let him in, and she made dinner and they sat at her table, the table where she and Thomas had eaten for 6 years, and it felt strange for about 10 minutes, and then it felt right. And Samuel ate his supper talking steadily about school and a new friend named Denny Marsh, who could spit farther than anyone in the county. And Eli listened to all of this with evident enjoyment. And when Samuel was in bed, Ella and Eli sat by the fire for a long time without saying much. And it felt like the most natural thing she had ever experienced. He left before 9 because that was proper, and she stood at the door watching him ride away up the dark road. And she felt the pull of his absence like a physical thing, and she sat down at her kitchen table and covered her face with her hands and smiled into her palms because she was so thoroughly, helplessly in love with him, and there was nothing whatsoever she could do about it. December came, cold and clear and brilliant. Ella had been quietly thinking, in the way she thought through important things, which was carefully and from every angle and over a long period, and she had arrived at a conclusion that felt settled and true. She went up on a Wednesday in the first week of December. The trail was icy and Clover picked her way carefully, and Eli was at the top to meet her because he had heard the mare's shoes on the stone. He helped her dismount in the way he had developed over the months, a hand at her elbow and then at her waist, brief and proper but warm, and she looked up at him and said before she lost her nerve, "I want to ask you something now." He looked down at her in the cold, clear light. "Ask," he said. "Are you going to ask me to marry you, or am I going to have to ask you?" she said. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then he let out a breath and it became a laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and genuine, and he put his hands on her face with that same extraordinary gentleness and said, "I was working up to it." "Work faster," she said, and he laughed again, and then he was very serious and he said, "Ella Grady, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said before the question was entirely finished. "Yes, I will." He kissed her then, for the first time, in the cold mountain air with the snow brilliant all around them, and it was as direct and unhurried and genuine as everything else about him, and she felt it all the way to the ground. They went inside and sat at his table, still in their coats at first because they were both a little stunned, and drank their coffee and talked about the practical things, which were actually the important things. They talked about where they would live. He had an attachment to his canyon that she understood and respected completely, but she also had a son who needed school and community and neighbors. They arrived, over the course of that afternoon, at a solution that was so sensibly obvious that she wondered why it had taken them so long to see it. He would begin building a second, larger cabin in the upper meadow in the spring. He had the timber, he had the skill, and with a couple of hired hands from town through the summer he reckoned he could have it framed and roofed before autumn. In the meantime, she and Samuel would stay in the house in town, which was paid for and sensible, and he would come to town on weekends, which would be perfectly respectable with the understanding that they were engaged. Samuel would have his school and his friends and the familiar landscape of Creston Hollow, and would also have 40 acres of mountain meadow and a man who answered every one of his questions. It was an arrangement that suited everyone extremely well. She told Samuel that evening. She had sat him on the kitchen table, which was her serious conversation location, and she had told him that she and Mr. Eli were going to get married, and she had watched his face carefully because this mattered most. Samuel had looked at her with his father's dark eyes and his own particular seriousness and said, "Does that mean I get to go up the mountain all the time?" "Yes," she said. "Does that mean Mr. Eli lives with us?" "Eventually, yes. We're going to build a new house up there." Samuel considered this. "Will there be room for a dog?" "I expect so." "Okay," he said, and hopped off the table and went back to his whittling project, which was currently trying to become a horse and not quite making it. She looked at the back of his small, bent head and felt love so large it was almost frightening. She told Martha Hollins the next day, who shrieked with delight and grabbed both her hands. She told Agnes Prout, who cried very gently and said Thomas would be pleased, and that helped Ella more than she could say. She told Nora Webb, who was 22 and newly beginning to emerge from her own grief, and who looked at Ella with such transparent hope in her eyes that Ella reached over and squeezed her hand and said, "It will come for you too." Word got around Creston Hollow with the usual speed of small-town information, which is to say everyone knew by Thursday. Horace Finch said he could have predicted it. Pastor Whitmore said he would be honored. The two loud cattlemen who had started the whole thing without knowing it, by talking in the general store in May, bought each other a drink in the saloon on Saturday evening and took unearned credit for the whole affair. The winter was the gentlest kind, cold but not brutal, with clean snow and bright days. Eli came to town every Friday evening and stayed until Sunday afternoon, and they had long evenings by the fire in her parlor, and she learned things about him in those winter months that deepened her love for him steadily and without fanfare. That he was a man who had taught himself to read well past the basic level, that he had a dry, quiet humor that took a moment to catch, that he had a particular softness about the natural world, that he could name every bird that came to the feeder outside the parlor window and knew which ones would stay through winter and which would go south, that he was patient in an active, engaged way rather than a passive one, and that he thought before he spoke. Every single time, which meant that when he told her she was the best thing that had happened to him in a long time, she knew he had weighed the sentence and chosen each word deliberately. She told him on a January evening, 6 weeks after the engagement, about the thing she had been thinking about, which was that she had never properly mourned Thomas in company. She had been so busy surviving that she had kept her grief very private, managed it in the early mornings before Samuel was up, gotten through it alone. She told Eli this by the fire quietly, and he listened without moving, and when she finished he said, "You don't have to have managed that alone." "I know that now," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it, simply held it for the rest of the evening, and they did not speak much more. But she felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for a year, and she was deeply grateful for a man who understood the difference between fixing something and simply bearing witness to it. The spring wedding was planned for the first Saturday in April, which turned out to be a day of extravagant beauty, blue sky and warming sun, and the first green coming up in the meadows below the canyon. Pastor Whitmore performed the ceremony in the Baptist church, which was full, because the whole town came. Ella wore a dress she and Martha Hollins had made together over the winter, a deep blue that Martha had insisted upon over the standard white or gray, and which Ella had agreed to because it was the color of the high-altitude sky in summer, and she loved it. Eli wore his good dark coat and a white shirt and a bolo tie that Horace Finch had lent him, and he stood at the altar with the careful, contained expression of a man who was experiencing something enormous and choosing not to embarrass himself in public. When she came down the aisle, his expression changed. He watched her walk toward him, and the careful containment just went, and what replaced it was so open and unguarded that several of the women in the pews reached for handkerchiefs without entirely knowing why. Samuel walked beside his mother down the aisle, a small serious figure in his good clothes, holding her hand. When they reached the altar, Eli crouched down and shook Samuel's hand very formally, and Samuel shook it back with equal gravity, and there was a sound in the church that was half laughter and half something more tender. The vows were the traditional ones, and Ella said them steadily and clearly, and Eli said them in that quiet, deliberate voice. And when Pastor Whitmore said they might kiss the bride, Eli kissed her with the same quality she had come to expect from everything he did. Fully meant, unhurried, completely present. They had a small celebration at the church hall after, with food brought by seemingly every woman in Creston Hollow, which meant there was enough to feed the whole territory. Martha had baked the wedding cake. Agnes Prout played the fiddle, which was a revelation. Nobody had known she played. Nora Webb danced with one of the young cattlemen from the Rafter T Ranch and blushed the entire time, which made Ella quietly pleased. Samuel fell asleep in the corner of the hall at 9 in the evening, and Eli carried him out to the wagon without waking him, and they drove home through the dark, still mountain night, the stars enormous overhead, and Samuel slept with his head in Ella's lap, and Eli drove with one hand on the reins and the other holding hers. The summer that followed was the best Ella had known. She and Samuel went up to the meadow every weekend, and sometimes through the week, because Harvey Pell let out school from mid-June and Samuel was free. The new cabin was progressing fast. Eli had engaged 2 men from town, brothers named Declan and James Marsh, whose family Ella knew slightly, and the 3 of them worked from first light to last most days, and by August the frame was up and the walls were rising and the roof was taking shape. Ella spent those weekdays at her town house, keeping up with her laundry clients, which she would continue through the year because she believed in having her own income regardless of any other circumstances, a belief she had formed in the difficult winter after Thomas died and had not been inclined to relinquish. She also kept up with her reading and her correspondence and her kitchen garden, and she felt, for the first time in years, that she was living in full rather than merely surviving. In June, she discovered she was expecting a child, and she sat with this knowledge for a week before telling anyone, sitting with it privately, feeling it settle into the shape of her life. It fit perfectly. Everything about it felt right. She told Eli on a Saturday evening in the meadow. They were sitting outside the old cabin, which was still perfectly functional, and where they stayed weekends while the new one was being built, watching Samuel try to coax a ground squirrel to eat from his hand. The evening light was coming horizontal across the meadow and everything was gold and green. She said, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her with full attention, the way he always looked when she said she had something to tell him. She told him. The expression that crossed his face was staggering in its openness. He sat very still for a moment, and then he put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against him, gently and firmly, and his voice when he spoke was not quite steady. "You're certain?" "I am," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. He did not say anything for a while, and she did not need him to. The silence he kept was full of everything that needed saying. Samuel looked over from his ground squirrel pursuit and saw his mother and Eli sitting close together in the evening light, and with the child's unfailing instinct for the emotional weather of adults, he sensed that something significant had happened. He came over and stood in front of them. "What?" he said. Ella laughed. "We'll tell you properly," she said. "Come here." She held out her arm and he climbed onto the bench between them, and she and Eli looked at each other over his head, and she thought that this was the exact center of her happiness, this bench in this meadow with these two, and she wanted to hold the moment like water in cupped hands. They told Samuel the following morning in the careful, age-appropriate way, and Samuel processed it for about 30 seconds and then asked if it would be a boy, because a boy would be better for adventures. Ella told him that was not how it worked. Samuel accepted this philosophically. The new cabin was ready in October, as Eli had promised. They moved in on a Saturday, the whole business taking one day because neither of them had a great deal of furniture, and the key pieces had been moved up by wagon in stages over the preceding weeks. The cabin was larger and finer than Ella had expected. 2 proper bedrooms and a big main room with a fireplace, and a real kitchen with a proper iron stove, and a long table that could seat 8. The windows on the south and east faces looked out over the meadow and caught the morning light perfectly. Ella stood in the middle of the main room the first evening, after Samuel was in bed, and turned around slowly, looking at everything. Eli stood in the doorway watching her. "Well," he said. "It's beautiful," she said. "Eli, it's genuinely beautiful. How long have you been planning this?" "Since about February," he said, with a slight self-consciousness that she found utterly endearing. She went to him and put her arms around him, and his went around her without hesitation, and they stood there in the firelight in their new home, and she felt such a completeness that she could not remember the last time she had felt it, or whether she had ever felt it quite this way, this deep, this still, this sure. They would still keep the townhouse. They had decided this together practically, because Samuel's school was in town, and there would be weather in winter that made the canyon trail impassable. And having the house in Creston Hollow meant they had a base in the community that mattered to both of them. They would spend the warm months on the mountain and winter in town when the trail was iced, and travel between the two as the seasons allowed. Creston Hollow had taken them in as a couple with the warmth that small communities reserve for the romances that seem obviously correct, the ones people feel they personally arranged, even when they had nothing to do with it. Eli, who had been a peripheral figure in the town for years, quietly respected but not well known, found himself drawn gently into the social fabric of Creston Hollow through Ella, who was woven through it at every thread. He came to know Martha and Agnes and Nora and Harvey Pell, and the Marsh brothers and old Horace Finch, not as faces in a crowd, but as people, with histories and troubles and specific qualities, and he found that he did not mind this the way he might once have. The solitude that had once felt like sufficiency now felt like what it had probably always been, a substitution for something he had not known how to seek. He kept baking bread. Ella discovered this in November when she caught him up at 4 in the morning in the kitchen of the town house, working the dough by lamplight with the sure, practiced motions of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She stood in the doorway in her robe, watching him for a moment before he sensed her and looked up. "You were awake," he said. "I'm always awake at 4 months along," she said. "I need water constantly." She came to the kitchen and sat at the table. "How long have you been doing this?" He shaped the loaf and covered it to rise before he answered. "About 2 years before I started leaving them," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother baked bread. It was the first thing I learned to cook, watching her. After she was gone, I kept doing it because, I don't know exactly, it felt like keeping something alive." He washed his hands at the basin. "And then that first winter, I could see from the canyon how hard things were in town. I could see the smoke from the widow houses, what little smoke there was, because they were conserving fuel. And I thought there was one thing I could do that might help, and that I could do without making anyone feel the weight of charity." Ella looked at him in the lamplight, this enormous, quiet, careful man who had learned his mother's bread and climbed on a horse in the dark for 2 years to leave it on strangers' porches, and she felt the love she had for him like a physical pressure behind her sternum. "You are a remarkable person," she said. He looked deeply uncomfortable with this. "I bake bread," he said. "Eli," she said. "It was something to do," he said firmly, and she laughed, and he smiled, and they sat in the lamplight while the bread rose. And outside, the Colorado winter pressed against the windows, cold and dark and indifferent. And inside, the lamp burned warm and the bread rose, and she carried their child, and the world was entirely right. Their son was born in February, the same month the bread leaving had started 2 years before, and they named him George Thomas Ralston. George for Eli's father, Thomas for Ella's husband, a bridge between what had been and what was. He was a large, loud baby who announced his opinions about every situation immediately and did not modulate his volume for anyone, which Samuel found extremely funny and which Eli regarded with an expression of affectionate bewilderment. The birth had been attended by the town midwife, a capable and reassuring woman named Dorothea Crane, who had delivered half the babies in Creston Hollow and who told Ella afterward that everything had gone well and the baby was perfectly healthy. Eli had waited outside the bedroom for the duration of this process, which was 3 hours, and when Dorothea finally opened the door and told him to come in, he crossed to the bed and looked at the baby in Ella's arms with an expression that she had not seen on any face before, a kind of wonder so raw and uncurated that she had to look away for a moment because it felt too private to witness directly, like looking at the sun. He put out one of his large hands and George grabbed his finger with startling force, and Eli made a sound that was almost inaudible and completely undone. "Hello," he said, in the gentlest voice she had ever heard him use. Samuel, who had been allowed in immediately afterward, circled the bed twice, and then announced that George was very red and very noisy, but that he reckoned he would be all right when he got bigger. Spring came again, the aspen trees budding gold-green along the canyon walls, the wildflowers coming up in the meadow in the colors that only high-altitude country produces, the sort of deep, clear purple and orange and yellow that seem almost improbable. They moved back up to the canyon cabin in April, George in a Moses basket that Eli had built over the winter from bent willow and cedar, and Samuel running ahead on the trail with the enthusiasm of someone released from winter confinement. The life they built in that mountain meadow was full in every sense. Eli ran his cattle and his trapping line and his kitchen garden, and Ella kept her correspondence work which she could do by mail and did not require her to be in town, and she grew her own kitchen garden which had expanded considerably and was producing abundantly, and she baked and read and taught Samuel his letters and numbers between school terms, and nursed George, and watched the seasons turn in the mountain country which was the most alive place she had ever been, where the drama of weather and wildlife was constant and surprising and never dull. Martha Hollins came up to visit in June, the first time Ella had managed to get any of her Creston Hollow friends to make the switchback trail. Martha, who was not naturally adventurous about heights, came up with her eyes half shut and her knuckles white on the reins, and arrived at the top shaking slightly and declared that the cabin and the meadow were worth every second of it. She stayed for 3 days. She and Eli got along with an ease that Ella had hoped for but not dared entirely to expect, because Martha was quick and sharp and easily bored, and Eli was the kind of person who could keep up with that without trying, which earned her genuine respect. Nora Webb came up in August, and she was better on the trail, and she was also different in a way Ella had suspected. She was less pale, less pinched, less careful. She had been walking out with the cattleman from the Rafter T Ranch. His name was Daniel Prescott, and he was 24 and steady and kind, and the change in her was evident and lovely. She and Ella sat in the meadow while the men and Samuel did something elaborate involving fence posts and rope, and Nora told her about Daniel carefully, the way someone speaks about something new and precious. And Ella listened and said all the right things and was genuinely happy, and also thought about her own winter of bread and solitude, and decided again that grief was not the end of anything, only a passage. The autumn of that year, 1880, was magnificent. The aspens turned early and in extraordinary colors, and there was a week in late September when the entire canyon was on fire with color, the red and orange and gold reflected in the creek below, and in the morning, frost on the meadow grass. Eli took Samuel up onto the high ridge above the cabin on a Saturday morning to check on the cattle, and they were gone most of the day. And when they came back, Samuel was sunburned and exhausted and incandescent with happiness, talking about the view from the ridge and the eagle they had seen, and the elk herd below, and how far you could see, all the way to mountains that were 2 days' ride away and still looked like a painting. That evening, when Samuel was asleep with George in his basket nearby, Ella and Eli sat outside on the bench as they often did in the evenings when the weather allowed, watching the canyon fill with dusk. The first stars were appearing, the particular brightness of mountain stars that is different from any other kind. Ella was leaning against his side and his arm was around her, and neither of them had spoken for some time because there was nothing necessary to say, only the presence of each other and the sound of the creek below and the cooling of the air. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "When I came here first," he said, "when I first built the old cabin and settled in the canyon, I told myself I had found what I was looking for, the land and the quiet and the work. I told myself it was enough and I believed it." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I was wrong about what I was looking for." She looked up at him. "I think I was looking for this," he said. "All of it, just didn't know it had a shape." She put her hand against his chest and he covered it with his. They sat until the stars were fully out, and the canyon was dark, and the fire inside was warm behind the glass. And she thought about the morning in January 2 years ago when she had stood at her window and watched Samuel in the yard and felt the terrible weight of alone. And she thought about the loaf of bread on the step with its ghost of warmth. And she thought about Horace Finch in the general store and 2 cattlemen with loud voices. And the cold morning she had ridden up a switchback trail on a brown mare named Clover with a tin of cookies and a whole unrealized future packed into her saddlebag without knowing it. She thought about how close she had come to not going. How many times she had talked herself out of it, told herself it was presumptuous, told herself the man valued his privacy, told herself it was not necessary, that she could simply be grateful in her own heart and leave it at that. And she thought about what would not have existed if she had listened to those voices, and it made her grip the hand over hers a little tighter. "I'm glad I came up the mountain," she said. He understood exactly what she meant, because he always did. "So am I," he said, in that quiet voice that she had come to love the way you love the sound of weather coming when you are already inside, deep and inevitable and safe. Winter came and they went down to Creston Hollow and George learned to sit up, and Samuel had a rival at school for best arithmetic and took it extremely personally and turned the entire rivalry into motivation. And Eli helped Agnes Prout replace the rotting boards on her porch because she had no one to do it and he noticed it needed doing. He still baked bread. It still appeared on porches. There was a new widow that winter, a young woman named Clara Dawes whose husband had died of a chest ailment in October, leaving her with an infant and a leaking roof, and not much else. The first time Ella saw Clara, it was in the general store, and Clara's baby was crying, and Clara had the look of someone who had been getting by on 4 hours of sleep and sheer stubbornness for weeks, and Ella recognized that look with the intimacy of someone who had worn it herself. She went over and introduced herself and said, without preamble, that she knew things were hard, and that if Clara needed company, she was welcome to come by any time. Clara looked at her with the careful, exhausted wariness of someone who has been receiving pity and was not sure what this was. Ella met her eyes steadily and waited. "I could use company," Clara said finally. "Then come on Thursday," Ella said. "I'll make coffee and my boy will keep yours entertained." Clara came on Thursday. She kept coming. By spring she was part of the fabric of things, and in spring she noticed, as all the widows in Creston Hollow noticed, that there was bread on her porch on Tuesday and Friday mornings. She asked Ella who was the person she most trusted by then who left it. Ella smiled. "Come up and meet him sometime," she said. "I'll take you up the mountain." She did take Clara up the mountain in May, on a warm Wednesday. Clara had never been on a switchback trail, and made the same face Martha Hollins had made the first time, eyes half shut and hands white on the reins, but she made it. And she came into the meadow and saw the cabin and the garden and the woodpile and the man splitting wood, and she saw how Ella's whole posture changed when she saw him, and how he put down the maul and came forward and put his arm around Ella's waist in the easy, unself-conscious way of a man who has found his home and knows it. And Clara understood everything she needed to understand about bread left on porches before sunrise. "He doesn't want thanks," Ella told her on the way down. "I know," Clara said. She was quiet for a moment on the trail, the canyon dropping away below them in folds of green and gray. "How did you know to go up and thank him anyway?" "I didn't know," Ella said. "I just thought it was the right thing to do, and I was trying very hard that winter to do right things even when I was frightened." She paused. "Especially when I was frightened." Clara nodded slowly, looking at the trail between her horse's ears. They came down to the flat and turned back toward Creston Hollow, and the afternoon was warm and the road was familiar, and Ella thought about being frightened and about right things, and about bread and mountains and gray eyes and a voice that meant everything it said. By the summer of 1881, George was walking, a perilous and exhilarating development that kept Ella and Eli in a constant state of alert readiness. He was a large, determined baby who had become a large, determined toddler and who approached every obstacle, including steps, slopes, gaps between fence boards and the creek bank, with the same undeterred optimism. Samuel took his role as older brother extremely seriously, and could frequently be found interposing himself between George and various hazards, with an expression of tired competence that made him look approximately 30 years old. Eli watched this fraternal arrangement with such undisguised satisfaction that Ella, watching him watch them, felt herself falling in love with him all over again, which was a thing that seemed to happen regularly, and which she had given up finding remarkable. It simply was. You could love someone at the beginning and then keep discovering reasons to love them more, and evidently this could go on indefinitely, and she found that was one of the best surprises life had prepared for her. That summer, on a long July evening, they sat together after the boys were in bed, and Eli opened the Walt Whitman book and handed it to her, as he sometimes did, and she read aloud until the fire burned low. Poem she read was about the open road, about setting out without knowing where you would end up, about the richness of the journey itself over any fixed destination. When she finished reading, he said, "That's the one I like best in that book." "Why that one?" she asked. He considered. "Because it doesn't pretend you know where you're going," he said. "It just says go, and trust that what you find will be better than what you planned." He looked at her across the dying fire. "I think that's true." She closed the book. "You rode south out of Wyoming without knowing where you were going," she said. "I did," he said. "And I rode up a mountain trail without knowing what I'd find." "You did," he said. "And here we are," she said. "Here we are," he said, with the simplicity that was his native language and that she loved without reservation. In September, Ella found she was expecting again. She told Eli, and he reacted with the same staggering, unguarded expression he had worn the first time, and she decided that this expression was something she would seek to produce as many times as possible in their shared life, because it was the most honest and beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. This time it was a girl. They named her Ruth, which had been Eli's mother's name. She was born in April of 1882, on a day that was, by complete coincidence and perfect appropriateness, a Wednesday. She was small and pale and had Eli's gray eyes from the first hour, and when Eli held her for the first time, standing by the window of the bedroom in the town house with the spring light coming in and Samuel watching from the doorway and George attached to Ella's bedpost and chewing on the corner of the quilt, he said very softly, "Hello, Ruth." And the baby opened her eyes and looked at him with a gravity and attention that made Dorothea Crane, who was still packing up her bag across the room, pause and smile. "She knows your voice," Ella said. He looked up from the baby's face with eyes that were not entirely dry. "She was listening when you read to her," he said. "I told her things about you," Ella said, "while you were sleeping and I was awake at 3 in the morning." "What kinds of things?" he asked. "That you were worth coming up the mountain for," she said. He came and sat beside her on the bed, Ruth in the crook of his arm, and she leaned against his shoulder. And Samuel came in from the doorway and climbed up on the other side, and George let go of the bedpost and toddled over and put his hands on the mattress and looked at the baby with an expression of extreme suspicion that eventually softened into reluctant interest. Creston Hollow grew in those years as the Colorado Territory grew around it, more families arriving, more businesses, a new school building in 1882 that replaced Harvey Pell's single room with 2 proper classrooms, a doctor who settled permanently instead of the traveling physician who had come through quarterly before. The town was changing, shaping itself into something more permanent, the way settlements did when people decided they were staying. Eli and Ella were staying. This was never in question, but it became more definite each year, each garden planted and harvested, each fence line extended. Each morning the bread went onto the porches, and each Wednesday the smoke rose from the canyon cabin chimney. They were woven into the place, which was how they both wanted it. Nora Webb married Daniel Prescott in the summer of 1882, a ceremony almost as well attended as Ella and Eli's had been. And Ella stood in the front pew with Ruth on her hip and George, holding her skirt and Samuel sitting very straight beside her. And she watched Nora walk toward the man who made her pale face bright, and she felt such complete, clear happiness for her that it was its own kind of fullness. Clara Dawes was doing better. Her infant was a sturdy toddler now, and her roof had been repaired. Eli had done it with James Marsh one autumn weekend, and declined to discuss payment, which was so entirely characteristic that Ella had simply stopped objecting to this kind of thing, and she had taken work as a seamstress that was beginning to be enough. She still came to Ella's house on Thursdays when they were in town, and she still received bread on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and she had started laughing again, which Ella took as the best possible measurement of recovery. In 1883, George at 3½ discovered horses with the intense, monomaniacal passion that sometimes takes hold of small children, and Eli introduced him to the gentlest horse on the property, an aging bay mare named Prudence, with the same quiet patience he had brought to teaching Samuel everything Samuel had ever learned from him. George could not be persuaded off Prudence's back if she were available, and when she was not, he stood at the fence talking to her in a running, detailed monologue that Ella was fairly sure was intelligible to the horse, even if it wasn't entirely to anyone else. Samuel, at 8, was a thoughtful and competent boy who read well above his grade level, which Harvey Pell mentioned to Ella with the combination of satisfaction and slight indignation of a teacher whose student has outgrown him. He had his father Thomas's steady, practical nature, And he had also absorbed something from Eli, a patience and a habit of observation, a tendency to watch the world around him carefully before forming an opinion. He was good company, the kind of child who could be in a room for an hour and say one thing, and it would be exactly the right thing. In the autumn of 1883, Eli and Ella sat on the bench outside the canyon cabin on an October evening and looked at the meadow and the mountains, and the aspens were turning, and the smoke from the chimney was going straight up in the still air, and Ruth was walking in the meadow catching late-season grasshoppers with a focus that suggested future scientific inquiry, and George was on Prudence in the near pasture under Samuel's loose supervision, and everything was, as far as Ella could see, entirely in order. She had thought about her life in pieces sometimes, the way you hold up fabric and look at it for color and weight. The years in Missouri, the marriage to Thomas and the move west, the 6 years of building a life in Creston Hollow, the terrible December and the brutal January, and then the bread on the step in the cold morning, still warm. The ride up the switchback trail with cookies in her saddlebag and a speech she never gave. Coffee at a table with 2 chairs. Wednesdays. A man who said things only when he meant them and who meant every single one. She looked at Eli beside her. He was looking at the mountains, as he often did with that complete resting attention. He was 38 now. The gray in his dark beard had increased over the years, and the lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper from years of squinting into mountain light, and she thought he was more handsome than he had been when she first rode into this meadow. That was probably a biased assessment, she acknowledged. She made it anyway. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He looked at her. "Gratitude," he said. She raised an eyebrow. Gratitude for what in particular? He considered this with his usual care. "That you knocked on my door," he said. "You invited me in for coffee," she said. "After I lied about the bread," he said. "Badly," she reminded him. "Very badly," he agreed. He took her hand. "I am grateful," he said simply, "for all of it, everything. From that day to today, all of it." She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched Ruth and George and Samuel in the meadow, her children moving through the last light of the day in the place their family had made. The mountains behind them rose immense and indifferent and forever, and the aspen trees burned gold, and the evening star appeared. "So am I," she said. The bread appeared on porches the next morning, as it had appeared for 5 years now, wrapped in brown cloth and tied with plain twine, warm from the oven and smelling of sourdough and wild honey and mountain herbs. No note, no name. Just bread, left in the dark before dawn by a man on a horse who believed that the smallest, most practical forms of care were worth crossing a mountain for. And on a high meadow above the canyon, the morning light came through the south and east windows of a log cabin and fell on a family at breakfast. The small girl with the gray eyes and the large, determined boy and the thoughtful older child, and the woman who had ridden up a mountain once on a brave impulse, and the man who had never been able to adequately explain why he kept 2 chairs at a table he ate at alone. And the coffee was on, and the bread was warm, and the day stretched out ahead of them. Full and ordinary and irreplaceable, the way the best days always are.